So on God's time, your time, what are you waiting for? What in life are you waiting for? Or maybe hope is a better word. What is it that you are hoping for? And maybe you've been hoping and waiting for a while. Or what is it that you're waiting for, and there's a part of you that kind of feels like it should have already happened, right? I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't have. You've been hoping, you've been praying. God can do this kind of stuff. And so why hasn't it happened yet? Or maybe, what is it that you have stopped waiting for? I mean, there was a time where you would pray for this on a pretty regular basis. You would talk to friends, and it was a real hope that this could actually happen. But as the days and the months and the years and maybe the decades have gone on, you just stopped hoping. You've stopped waiting. And so now maybe, what is it that you just feel like, you feel like God's just disappointed you? Maybe you would even say that you're angry at God because it could have, it should have, it seemed like he did for others, but not for you. So how has God disappointed you? Today we are kind of launching into the official beginning of our series on Luke. Luke is the gospel according to Luke, and so the gospel is the story of Jesus. And what Luke tells us is that he took the time to carefully investigate the things that Jesus said, the things Jesus did, every single one, which is a part of the good news. And he wants to now kind of let us know what all those things are about. And so for the next year or more, we're going to be very slowly going through every story that Luke investigated, everything that Jesus said, and looking at exactly what is the gospel. And as we kind of launch in today, there's a word that I think we're going to end up going back to quite a bit as we go into this series, and it's the word tension. Doesn't that sound exciting? Who wants to just be comforted by tension? Who wants a little bit more tension at Christmas? But as we go through the book of Luke, this is something that we're going to constantly come face to face with. There's just this tension that I think Luke wants us to feel. And here's at least one of the tensions, is kind of this tension between what we want to be and what actually is. And here's the way I'll describe this. I had a friend years ago, none of you guys know him. His name is Sean, different Sean than a Sean you're probably thinking of because I don't think any of you guys know him. But Sean was going to see a Christian counselor, and as he was talking to the Christian counselor, he was kind of laying out all of these things about here's what I believe, and here's these things that should happen, and just kind of talking about here's the way in which things are. And Sean was trying to do it through the lens of Christianity. Because I'm a Christian, here's the way that things are. And the counselor stopped him at one point and was like, wait, Sean, I don't think you're actually a Christian. You're not practicing Christianity, you're practicing Seanianity. You've kind of created your own little system of here's the way that things are, here's the way that God acts, here's the way the Bible should be interpreted. And it's it's all kind of your own lens that you've taught yourself or caught from other people, and it's not actually the way things actually are. And I get that. And maybe some of you guys get that too, because I can practice a little bit of Jonathanianity. I have a way that I want God to be. I often have a way that I want the Bible to be. I have a way that I think that if I was God, here's the way I would do things. And so therefore, that's how God should do things. And I have to come to this tension of is this how I want things to be? How maybe I've been taught things are? Or is this actually what Jesus is saying it is? And there's a bunch of different examples of that. So here's a couple of different examples of ways in which things I have heard that sound pretty good, I think, that I would like to be true. I just don't know if they're actually what Christianity actually is. Here's a couple of them. I've heard that good things happen to good people. And doesn't that sound good? You're good, and if you're good, you'll be rewarded with good things. Like, isn't that the way that things should work? Isn't that how God should do everything? Or everything happens for a reason. So anything that happens, like, oh, somehow there's some sort of a good master plan behind it. And doesn't that sound wonderful? We're going to look at some books later on, or I'm going to reference some books by an author named Kate Bowler. I talked about her once. She has a book that I didn't bring with me today, but it's called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies That I Wish Were True. It's worth reading. Hard work pays off. Man, I want that to be true. I want to be able to like put my nose down and like work hard, and then like whatever I've worked hard at, somehow there's a payoff on that. And everything will work out in the end. I love those things. What I wish, I mean, is we like go into like Christmas season, the way that I wish things work a lot of times is kind of just like the idea of like Christmas, that there's like a naughty nice list, and like as long as you're on the nice list, then you're going to get all of the good things. And I say that because I can be pretty like deceptive in myself, because I often think of myself as good and hardworking and nice. And so I think that this system should work. But then all of a sudden when I'm discovered to be more naughty, when I've discovered that I actually haven't been working that hard, when I've discovered that things aren't that good, then I actually don't want any of those systems to come true. And I just kind of like to make up my own little thing. And maybe some of you feel the same deal. Is that when you look at God, when you look at the things that God should do, there's just this tension of it. There it is finally. There's just this tension between the gospel that I want to be true and the gospel that actually is. And so today as we launch in, I think Luke just kind of jumps into this right from the beginning. We're going to look at a story of Zechariah and Elizabeth that Trudy just read for us. And kind of all throughout this, there is this tension. And I just want to let you know from the beginning, I'm not going to try to settle all the tensions, because I don't think that's the goal of what Luke is trying to present to us in the actual gospel. I don't think that the actual gospel that Luke wants to present to us is that somehow everything ties up in a nice, tidy bow and good things happen to good people. There's just this like tension of like God working in our world and really difficult things that we don't totally understand, and them just like being there together. And we're invited to like walk into that with God, not try to always settle it. So we're going to go through the story, and I'm going to try to point out some of these, and I'm guessing that as we do, you're going to find yourself specifically in some of these tensions. So here's how the story begins. In the time of Herod, king of Judah. So it kind of starts off right from the beginning. Here we're finding this story in the nation of Israel. And in the nation of Israel, the king of Judah is not an Israelite, is not a Jew. The king of Judah is this guy named Herod, who was not Jewish, who was not an Israelite, and who was not a particularly good person. He was actually a terrible person. He was known as kind of this tyrant king, killed multiple members of his family when he thought they were trying to take power, killed lots of other people. We're introduced in the book of Matthew that he released a genocide of little kids. This was this terrible person that was ruling over. And here's this nation of Israel being ruled by a terrible person. And that kind of automatically conflicts with kind of what they wanted in the nation of Israel. So in the Bible, it's kind of two big sections, Old Testament, New Testament. And in the Old Testament, it has all these different promises that God wants to do in the nation of Israel. And this is one from Deuteronomy chapter 28. It says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commands that I give you today, the Lord will set you high above the nations of the earth. And that kind of feels like naughty and nice, doesn't it? That kind of feels like, okay, we do the right things and God will reward our nation. But here we are, about 1,500 years or so after that promise was made. And instead, in the nation of Israel, we have Herod, who's the king of Judah. And at the same time, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. So maybe it was like God rewards nations. And so maybe the nation wasn't really following God at that time, which I think you could actually make a pretty good argument that 2,000 years ago, at the time Jesus was born, that the nation of Israel was following the rules of God maybe better than they ever had in their whole history. They weren't always following them for the right reasons, but they were like doing a pretty good job of like having this synagogue system down. But maybe still, so maybe God wasn't totally rewarding them yet because some of the people were still bad. But surely he will like reward the good people, right? And so we're introduced to Zechariah and Elizabeth. And here's what it says about Zechariah and Elizabeth. Is that both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Can you imagine that being written about you? Like, hey, tell me about John. Like, how's John doing in like obeying all the things of God? He's doing it blamelessly. I mean, but somehow as the story was recorded about these two people, they were living such good, I'm sure not perfect, but good lives that they were considered to be blameless. And so surely if anybody was going to be rewarded, it would be somebody like Zechariah and Elizabeth. But the story goes on with a but. And that's exactly where some of us start to enter into the story. I mean, some of us probably enter in like in the nation part, where we're like, okay, surely God should be blessing our nation, and some of us don't like the political environment right now. Some of us don't like the political environment that's going to be in January, and we feel like that's a dissonance. But even deeper for a lot of us is this idea that like we feel like we're not living perfectly, but we feel like we're doing all the right things. We feel like we're working as hard as we possibly can. But there's a but. There's this but of this thing that is not working out the way that we want it to be. We're waiting on something that we feel like should have happened, could have happened. God could do this. He's done it for other people, but he's not doing it for me. Here's their but. It says, but they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Again, this wasn't just like a tension of like living in like, it's difficult to not be able to have kids, but they were living blamelessly for God. And so they could have had this like tension of like, but doesn't God tell us that he's going to reward us for being good? In that same passage we just read in Deuteronomy 28, I want to read it all to you. It says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord will set you high above the nations on earth, and all these blessings will come to you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country, and the fruit of your womb will be blessed. I mean, isn't that what the promise says? You do these things, you follow God, and you're going to be able to have kids. Kids were a sign that God was giving you your blessing. But yet in this story, there's this but. You have these people that are living blamelessly, but they can't have kids. And that's just a tension. Again, I don't want to try to like answer that and put like a nice little bow on it. I just want to like know like as we look at like the gospel as Luke presents it, that this just is. That there's this tension of like someone can live blamelessly, but yet God hasn't given them what they want yet. There can be a but, and that can just be part of it, and that might be part of what you guys are living through. And what I want you to know is that that's something that you can be honest about. Point out a couple of these different books. She's just been a huge help to me. Her name is Kate Bowler, author, writer. She's written a couple of different prayers. And why she's been especially so powerful to me is because she was referenced to me by my mom. And my mom, and some of you guys are in your own situations like this, is one of those people who's just kind of like living in this moment. She's had cancer when I was a kid, almost died, somehow kind of like miraculously made it. But now she's living through like another chronic illness that is slowly taking away her mobility and will eventually take away her life. And there's no like answer to it. There's no like, oh, well, because you didn't do these things, that's why you're living through this. It's just this but moment of someone who's like the best person ever living through one of the most difficult times, and that's the world that we live in. And I think Kate does such a good job of kind of letting us walk into that tension. So I want to share one of the prayers. This is a great book. It has 40 different devotions, and devotions are kind of famous for like wanting to tie bows on things. And these are 40 devotions for when like life sucks and you're just trying to walk through it. And so this might be a book some of you want to pick up. Here's one of those prayers. She says, "Blessed are you when you are disappointed, when you have prayed and hoped and wished, and still your cry for help goes unanswered. Blessed are you in the grip of radical honesty that says, God, what are you doing? Why don't you answer? What is so hard about making something good happen when I've laid it all out before you and all of its terrible reality?" If you're in one of those moments, if that's a prayer you can relate to, I just want to let you know that you are not alone. You're not alone in this room, and you're not alone in the story that God presents as gospel. The story goes on for Zechariah and Elizabeth. It says, "Once when Zechariah's division was on duty and when he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense." And so a little bit of what's going on here. So Zechariah was a priest in that day and age. There was about 8,000 priests. So it was all that, not that unique of a job. You couldn't have 8,000 priests all serving at the temple at one time. And so they had to have shifts. And so each shift was about 2 weeks long. And so each priest would work for 2 weeks a year. It's a good gig if you can get it. And so they would work for 2 weeks. And during that, they would kind of divide up tasks that they were going to do. And like the job was the person who was going to get to walk into kind of this center part of the temple and get to offer a sacrifice. And it was kind of like this big, huge honor. And so the way that the temple was laid out, there's kind of like different areas. Some of you guys seen pictures of the temple before. And it's kind of like an area where like kind of anybody could go to. And then there's an area where just Jewish people could go to, where just men could go to, where just priests could go to. And then there's this very center section. And in the center of it was a Holy of Holies, where only the chief priests could go. And literally right outside that room was this other place where this priest got to go and give sacrifices, like the second most holy place in the whole nation of Israel. And Zechariah is an old man, we find out. And so for his whole, and the way they chose this is by they would pick lots, like draw straws, like who gets his turn. And so for his whole career, he has gone to the temple and served his 2 weeks, and I'm sure wanted to have that honor. And for years, as they're like picking it's never been him. It's someone else. It's that guy. It's this person. It's never been him. He's always been passed by. And we get to see a little bit of the resolution here, but I bring that up because that might be the tension that you're living in. It's more like career-wise. Is you've been putting in all your time at your career, and it feels like there's this like randomness. Where like other people are like excelling in their careers, other people are getting the opportunity, and you're just not. The lot keeps passing over you, and that's the tension that you're living in today. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zacharias saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. And so he walks into this holy place, an angel, and he's like, freaked out, which like at the one hand, it's like it kind of makes sense that he's freaked out because like I don't know what it's like to see an angel. I haven't seen an angel, but it's like I'm sure that would be a little bit freaky. But also, there's like a regular thing that whenever God's presence kind of like shows up, especially whenever an angel shows up, everyone always kind of has this like kind of like startled thing, and so that's not like uncommon. But Zechariah has walked into the second most holy place in all of Israel. And God's presence has shown up in a very real way in an angel. And he's a little bit like startled by it. And I think there's something like, I don't know, that just resonates to me in that. This idea of like walking into a place where you feel like God's presence is going to be there. And then you walk in and you're a little bit startled that God actually showed up. We around here point to a lot of ways that we want you to feel the presence of God. We hope on a Sunday morning you feel the presence of God. We hope that when you do a daily office, if you do that, you feel the presence of God. You have a weekly Sabbath. But isn't it true for some of us that like we go through those habits and we've been walking into these places where like we kind of at one level believe that God could show up, but if God were to actually show up, we'd be a little freaked out about it. And maybe we're just like even a little bit like part of our tension is that we feel like we've entered into some of these areas, and it feels like when other people tell their story about when God showed up, we feel like maybe that hasn't happened for us in the way that we want it to. And we want to be a little bit startled by God, and it hasn't quite happened for us yet. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John." A couple of different things on this. One, the idea that he heard his prayer. And I wonder, like, when were they praying this? Like, and was this something that they were still praying? I don't know how old Zechariah and Elizabeth were. That people have different ideas. But I would guess that this is something you've been waiting and hoping for. At some point, it would fade a little bit. And maybe if you were to, like, a certain age, maybe you're not even, like, hoping for it anymore. At some point now, you get to an age where, like, if you find out you have kids, there was a day and age where if Ash and I found out we were pregnant again, it might be a little bit exciting. I'm only 44, and if we find out that we're pregnant, it's not going to be all that exciting because you get to a point, it's like, I don't even know. So is this something that they've even hoping and praying for anymore? But then there's also this tension of, like, Zechariah just found out that this prayer, that I think that they've stopped praying. That's my interpretation of it. That God heard that. And somehow Zechariah that wasn't even like aware to him. Like, he'd been praying this, and so maybe you have those feelings sometimes where you're praying, it feels like you're just like talking to the ceiling. You're like, is anyone even hearing this? And he's now introduced to this tension of like, I heard your prayer, even though you didn't know I was listening. I heard your prayer, even though I didn't do anything about it. And that's like kind of this reality that God apparently has this ability to hear prayers and not actually act on it when we want him to. And maybe God is hearing your prayer that you've been praying, even if it doesn't feel like it. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he is filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteousness, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Now, as we listen to this, maybe those mean something to you. I'm guessing for Saul, they don't have like this kind of big meaning. But for Zechariah, 2,000 years ago, this priest, trained priest, literally each of those phrases would have been like a hyperlink. Because each of those phrases is like direct scripture. It was these things that Zechariah, who'd been going to temple, who'd been going to synagogue, there's Old Testament of the Bible, these things that God had spoken and prophesied that Zechariah had been like holding on to as a nation. And now all of a sudden, Zechariah is saying, all those things that I've been promised are going to come true in your son. And again, that's just kind of this like reality of like, I've heard your prayer, but I didn't do anything. Some of you, if you know kind of like the way that the Bible's put together, the Bible's put together in kind of what we call the Old Testament of the Bible, and then there's the New Testament of the Bible, which is where we start here with Luke and Jesus. And there's this weird spot in between kind of the Old Testament ends with all these prophets, all these people prophesying what God is going to do. Many of them prophesying at a really tough time in the nation of Israel when they were captives in Syria and in Babylon, when things were very, very difficult, and saying, someday I'm going to send a son, someone's going to be born, and it's going to make everything better. And then in between these kind of prophecies that things are going to get better, all these things that were now hyperlinked to Zechariah, there's what they call this 400 years of silence. There's 400 years between hope is on the way and when hope actually arrives. And again, it's just this tension of like, I've heard your prayer and I'm waiting. I'm doing it in my own time. And the real gospel that we're presented with is that God moves, God is active, God does fulfill his promises, but he does it slow. And if decades go by, if centuries go by, if people's lives start and end and God hasn't got around to doing his promise yet, I'll be honest, I don't always like that, but that is the story that we have. That is the real gospel, and that's what Zechariah is being presented with. That God is finally doing this thing that he said he was going to do 400 years ago, and for all those people who lived and died in that time period, God is now finally getting around to do what he said he was going to do. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." Again, Zechariah was this trained priest, and I'm guessing like many of us, if you ask Zechariah, like, do you believe in the Bible? He'd be like, oh, I believe in the Bible. Do you believe that God can do the things in the Bible? I think he would have said yes. I think if you said, like, hey, do you think that, like, let's look at some of these particular stories. There's a story in the Old Testament about this old couple, Abraham and his wife Sarah, who were very old in age, thought they were way past the days of ever having kids. Their wish didn't come true. And then as a very old couple, God came to them and allowed them to have kids. Like, Zechariah, do you believe that story is true? I was like, yes, I believe that story is true. But do you believe it can happen for you? Well, it just seems impossible. And for some of us, that's like the supernatural tension that we live in the Bible sometimes. Is that we read some of these stories and we think they sound great. And there's a part of us that's like, yeah, I believe these things can actually happen. I believe that God can do these things. But there's a part of us that doesn't quite believe that it can actually happen to us. And I get that. I get that tension. And the angel said to him, I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. I think it's a whole kind of interesting deal. He didn't believe, and because he didn't believe, now he can't talk. We had an interesting discussion in my community group when we were talking about this, of this thing of Zechariah not being able to speak. Was this a curse or was this a blessing? Because you could kind of see it from like both angles. That there's something about like that this wouldn't have been good to not be able to talk, and there's something about it that could be kind of good. There's a good friend of mine who a little more than a year ago tore his Achilles. And he's an incredibly active guy, constantly doing things and just go. Has actually regularly talked about that I need to like tone things down a little bit and not be so crazy because it's kind of burning me out and burn my family, but just literally couldn't stop. Tore his Achilles, and when he first tore it, he's like, this is going to like wreck my next year because I'm going to have to like go to rehab. I can't do all the things that I know I want to do, I need to do. And it's transformed his year. I met him for coffee a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that, you know what, this having my Achilles and having be forced to slow down this past year has been one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And maybe some of you have experienced that before, where something like felt like it was going to be a really terrible thing, and there was actually good in it. And what's hard in those situations is to like kind of have the tension of both those things being true. Because it's easy to like just like put a silver line back, no, this is actually good, and like kind of get away from the part that like part of this is just terrible. And it's also easy to like just look at this is all good and not. And part of the tension is we need to like hold both. This is probably really hard for him and really good. And potentially whatever you're going through in life right now might be really hard and it might be really good. It can be both. We don't have to choose, and God doesn't call us to choose. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them, and they realized he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When the time of service was completed, he returned home after his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. And the Lord has done this. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people, and they all lived happily ever after. That part is not actually in the story. Because some of you guys know the rest of the story. In this case, their long wait came now with this amazing joy of having a baby. This baby would grow up to have a career that surely was way different than what they imagined his career would look like. And then their son would end up being executed, beheaded by another Herod. There's a lot of difficulty still to be had in this beginning of a joyful story. At this time, when Elizabeth is getting pregnant and giving birth, there were surely many other women in Israel who were waiting on a baby who their baby would never come. In a couple weeks, we're going to be introduced to a woman named Anna. And Anna is one of the first people to meet the baby Jesus, and she met him in the temple. And we're told about Anna that she lived her whole life, was married, her husband died. She never had kids, and she lived and she died and never had kids. For some people, the story is not always like rosy, glowy. There's not always a happy ending. And that's just the tension of it all. And so what we're supposed to kind of hold from this story is not this idea that like God will always come through in exactly what we want, but that God is with us and there is hope. Here is, you can go ahead and come up, Lenore. Here's my hope that we come out of this story with. I want to read this quote by Tish Harrison Warren. I'm going to read a little bit from her. But here's what she says. There is eternal brilliance. As we look at this story, I want us to have this kind of realization that like eternal, good, supernatural, God-fulfilling promises comes true. There is eternal brilliance. And over the next couple days of Christmas, I hope you experience that. But also, it is not quite enough to resolve our questions or tie it up in a nice metaphysical bow. But sometimes it is enough to get us through the next hour. And in enduring mystery, we need just enough light to take one more step. And for some of us, that's the eternal mystery that we're looking for this holiday season, is just to take one more step. I want to read a little bit more from Tish Harrison Warren. There's an article, I shared it in the weekly. There's a lot more to this, and so I encourage you to read the whole article. It's really, really honest and helpful, I believe. I'm going to read this. After we read it, we're going to sing a song about waiting. Christmas is this coming Wednesday, but we are actually still in the season of Advent. And Advent is it's a season of waiting and waiting. And if we're in that moment, it's okay for you to be in that season of waiting too. While we sing, I want to give you an opportunity. If you are in a moment right now where it's just tough, we would like to give you the chance to be able to be prayed for. And so I'm going to ask Sandy, Leslie, myself, can I get one more guy? John, would you be? All right. Sorry, I need another guy. You sure? Sandy, John, and Leslie and I are going to kind of go around the room and just like stand. And if you would like to be prayed for, we would love to pray for you. If that's not something you want to do, that's okay. I just want to give you that opportunity. I want to read you this from Tish, and then we're going to sing together. It was a dark year in every sense. It began with the move from my sunny hometown, Austin, Texas, to Pittsburgh in early January. 1 week later, my dad back in Texas died in the middle of the night. Always towering and certain as a mountain on the horizon, he was suddenly gone. The next month, we found out we were pregnant again. It felt like a miracle. But early on, I began bleeding, and the pregnancy became complicated. I was put on medically restricted activity. I couldn't stand for long periods, walk more than a couple blocks, or lift anything above 10 pounds, which meant I couldn't lift my then 4-year-old. As I spent hours sitting in bed each day, my mind grew dimmer and darker. The bleeding continued near constantly for 2 months, with weekly trips to the hospital. When it picked up, we worried I was miscarrying or in danger of another hemorrhage. In the end, in late July, early in my second trimester, we lost another baby, a son. During that long year, as autumn brought darkening days and frost settled in, I was a priest who couldn't pray. I didn't know how to approach God anymore. There were too many things to say, too many questions without answers. My depth of pain was overshadowed by my ability with words. And more painfully, I couldn't pray because I wasn't sure how to trust God. Martin Luther wrote about seasons of devastation of faith, when any naive confidence in the goodness of God withers. It's then that we meet what Luther calls the left hand of God. God becomes foreign to us, perplexing, perhaps even terrifying. Adrift in the current of my own doubt and grief, I was flailing. I began seeing a counselor, and when I told her about my sadness and anxiety at night, she challenged me to turn off digital devices and embrace what she called comfort activities. Each night, a long bath, a book, a glass of wine, prayer, silence, journaling, maybe. No screens. I fell off the wagon probably 100 times in as many days, but I slowly started to return to prayer. I needed words to contain my sadness and fear. I needed comfort, but I needed the sort of comfort that doesn't pretend that things are shiny or safe or right in the world. I needed a comfort that looked unflinchingly at loss and death. Prayer can speak to God in the dark, and that's what I had to learn to do. To pray in the darkness of anxiety and vulnerability and doubt and disillusionment. While we're drowning, we need a lifeline. And our lifeline in grief cannot be mere optimism that maybe our circumstances will improve, because we know that that may not be true. We need practices that don't simply placate our faiths or pain, but that teach us to walk with God in the crucible of our own fragility. During that difficult year, I didn't know how to hold on to God and the awful reality of human vulnerability. What I found was that it was the prayers and practices of the church, the real church, that allowed me to hold to, or rather to be held by God when little else seemed sturdy, to hold to that Christian story even when I found no satisfying answers. Would you stand as we pray and sing together?